Hey everyone, I'm going to take some time here to walk you through a couple of sample rhetorical analysis essays written by two students who were assigned the Last Rites for Indian Dead article that we looked at recently from the Los Angeles Times back in 1989. Now, what I'm going to do essentially is point out some do's and don'ts to the rhetorical analysis using these two student essays as our samples. There are a couple of things I need to talk to you about before we get started, though. First off, I can't really comment on the process that either of these students went through and what specifically they were told to do or not to do on their own rhetorical analyses because these were not students of my own. They were students in other composition sections, and so I can't entirely say what directions they were given with respect to this assignment. However, because most rhetorical analysis essays tend to function in very similar ways, much of what you're going to see in these two samples, especially with regard to the things that you want to make sure that you do, as well as the things you want to avoid doing, those are pretty much even across the board. In other words, regardless of who their instructor was, and even the instructions that they were given for the most part, most of what I'm going to be going over with you would apply regardless. So with that in mind, we're going to start with the essay that you can currently see on the screen called There's No Reason to Care. So right out the gate, the first thing that I'm actually going to tell you about is something I want you to very much avoid doing. And it has everything to do actually with the title of this particular essay. One of the problems with this rhetorical analysis is that the writer did too much in the way of inserting their own personal opinion about the issue itself. And that starts actually with the title, There's No Reason to Care. She was very, very insistent throughout the essay that this issue was not something that required so much attention or interest. And that is irrelevant. While your opinion in general about any topic is not, in the larger scheme of things, irrelevant, for the sake of the rhetorical analysis essay, it absolutely is. While you may have very strong feelings about the topic at hand, you have to keep those away from your essay. Unlike the critique essay and the comparative article analysis essay, where I might have allowed some, particularly with the critique essay, it was a part of the assignment, for some personal response. Here it is absolutely not allowed. So that's one of the things that you're going to notice as we take a look at this essay, which, by the way, we're not going to read from start to finish. I'm just going to point out some things that you want to make note of, again, both in terms of things you want to do, as well as with respect to things you want to avoid. So let's go ahead and keep moving and take a look with the introduction. So the introduction, as you know by now, I hope, that I tend to ask for specific things that usually are very common in introductory paragraphs. First and foremost, some sort of structured attention getter. What we see at the opening in this particular essay is really nothing of the sort. There is no structured sort of attention getter. She just kind of jumps right into her feeling that Susan Harjo's argument in Last Rites for Indian Dead is too one-sided. Well, be that as it may, and technically it is one-sided, but remember, I pointed out when we talked about Last Rites for Indian Dead that as an op-ed piece, Harjo is completely allowed to be one-sided and to just present her own opinion. Nevertheless, one of the things you want to keep in mind is that a structured attention getter of some sort is absolutely a good way to get started because you don't want to just dive right in. And unfortunately, that is something that this writer did. Now, what she does do technically correctly in the next part of the introduction is offer a little bit of an overview as to Harjo's argument. And that is something that I do want you to do in your own essay. In particular, I want you to give a formal introduction to the article that you're working with. So give the title of the piece, who wrote it, when it was published, and where it was published, as you identify for the reader in your introduction the main idea of the piece itself. Then we move into the thesis statement, because there really are just three parts to your introduction: the attention getter, a quick introduction to the article and its main idea, and then your thesis statement. And the thesis statement is something where you have to be very clear about the strategies and techniques that were used especially well, or that might have posed a problem or obstacle of some sort to the success of the essay as a whole. Now, as I'll be pointing out on several occasions, but I'm going to point out here as well, is please do not just say ethos, logos, and pathos. Those are the strategies that are being used. Of course they are. But I want you to talk more specifically beyond the appeals themselves about specific strategies and techniques. And that is one of the problems that we see in this thesis statement. She talks about ethos, logos, and pathos, but she doesn't specify exactly the strategies or techniques that are working or not working in the essay itself. Now, the next part of the essay is where you give a summary. And by now you should be getting fairly well acquainted with what a summary is and what it does, what it shouldn't do, etc. But again, just to remind you, your main focus in your summary is to focus on the ideas that are being presented, the what of the summary, not the how. The how is something you're going to be getting into in the rhetorical analysis portion of the essay itself. Focus on the main ideas of the argument being presented and nothing else. Make sure that you do not quote in your summary, as well as provide any personal response of any kind to the essay. So that's all you need to know about the summary. With regard to the summary that you see here, her summary has some problems in terms of its structuring and phrasing. Again, I can't get into that in too much detail, but on a closer examination, if we were to look at this really closely, I would point out some of the phrasing problems that she has in this summary, but also the way that it is not entirely complete. So you want to make sure also that you're presenting a complete summary that would give the reader a really good idea of the major ideas in that piece, especially for a reader who is not familiar with that piece. You want to make sure that you give them all of the stuff they need in order to understand the rhetorical analysis to come. All right, so now as we move to the rhetorical analysis, and I'm going to move through this a little more quickly, the big problems with her rhetorical analysis is that she doesn't really clearly identify actual techniques that the author must use. The one thing that she does do right, though, is that she provides topic sentences. This is important. Remember that from here on out, we're using the meal plan. Main idea, evidence, analysis, and link back to the thesis itself. Your body paragraphs, specifically your rhetorical analysis paragraphs, should be structured using the meal plan. So that means each topic sentence that opens your rhetorical analysis paragraphs should identify a specific strategy that is being used. And not only that, it should clarify whether that strategy is being used well or not well. The rest of the paragraph should focus on providing at least two pieces of evidence or examples of the strategy that you're talking about, analyze them in terms of what they, especially whether they're successful or unsuccessful and why they are or are not successful, and then create that connection back to your larger thesis. What we have here in part with her body paragraphs, her rhetorical analysis paragraphs here, is that she again really struggles with not engaging on a personal level. This happens a bit. She also misidentifies Emory Johnson as on one time as the Surgeon General and later not as the Surgeon General. So she engages in some errors and she doesn't really kind of connect things. We're not sure exactly why the examples that she's giving connect back to her kind of starting point in the topic sentence. She also uses a rather strange analogy about the dentist recommending toothpaste, which was a little confusing. Then when she gets to the paragraph about pathos or emotion, again, she has a hard time making clear what actually the strategies are that are being used to elicit a specific emotional response in the reader. And as usual, she again has a hard time kind of separating herself from how she feels personally about the issue, especially her assumption and her insistence that the piece is biased, and that's a problem. So she tends to overlook the fact that because it's an op-ed, it is allowed to be one-sided or biased. Now, as we kind of come to the end here, because I want to take a quick look at another essay, this tends to repeat itself a bit. It generalizes in terms of the appeals. It mixes up the appeals at certain points. confusing ethics for ethos, if I remember correctly with this essay. And when she talks about logos here in this second to last paragraph, it's really, really general. It's unclear what specific pieces of evidence and types of evidence that she's talking about. And again, what makes the logos good or not good. It's again, very, very unclear and muddled. The conclusion, when you come to the conclusion, by the way, you really should focus on clarifying what was most successful about these strategies, and think a lot about the rhetorical situation in which your essay is embedded. It might be a really useful and productive way to think about and build your conclusion by going back and reflecting on the rhetorical situation itself, especially kairos and doxa, as well as the audience that you think is being addressed or really targeted in your essay. There's no real specific or best strategy to handle the conclusion, but I can tell you one thing. Generality is not going to be your friend. Be really specific, but also avoid being overly repetitive. This is another problem because she actually repeats her thesis statement as the very last sentence of her essay. There were a lot of issues with this essay. I've used it before in grade norming sessions for this particular assignment, and this one never really scores higher than a C. In fact, sometimes it scores around a D level. It does struggle quite a bit. So we're going to take a look. I'm going to go ahead and record a separate video where I talk about another essay also analyzing the No More Grave Desecration essay that analyzes the last rites for Indian dead. The name of the essay is No More Grave Desecration, and it also analyzes the same article that we see here. But that one is a little more successful. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and I'll meet you in the other video where I'll talk a little more quickly about the second one. All right, thanks guys.